I was standing in the florist's shop picking out tulips, yellow ones because Daniel always said yellow was the color of good news, when my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. The message was from my husband of 6 years, and it read, "Happy March 8th, X. Don't come back. We changed the locks." I read it 3 times before my fingers went numb, the tulips slipping from my hands onto the wet tile floor, their petals scattering like small broken suns across the dirty white grout. The word X hit me like something physical, like a fist driven through plate glass. But it was the word "we" that stopped my breath entirely, because I understood in the space between one heartbeat and the next that I had not been betrayed by one person. I had been betrayed by 2, and the second one had been sleeping in my guest room for the past 3 months, drinking my coffee every morning and calling me sweetheart with a warmth that I had, God help me, almost started to believe. It was March 8th, International Women's Day. And the man who had once held my hand through my mother's funeral, who had danced with me in our kitchen to a song neither of us knew the words to, who had sat beside me in the hospital waiting room for 4 hours when my appendix ruptured and refused to leave, even when I told him to go home and sleep. That man had chosen this specific day, this deliberate and pointed day, to end 6 years of marriage in 11 words. Later, when I had time to think clearly, I would understand that the date was not a coincidence. Nothing I would learn over the weeks that followed had been a coincidence for a very long time. The quiet life I had built with Daniel on Elmwood Drive was the kind of life that looks, from the outside, almost embarrassingly ordinary, and I mean that in the best possible way. I had purchased our 3-bedroom house 4 years before we were married, using the inheritance left to me by my grandfather, a retired engineer from Tallinn who had spent 40 years saving every spare dollar and had left it, without fanfare, to his only granddaughter. The house had cost me almost everything I had, and I had bought it in my name alone, with the particular pride of someone who has done something solely by their own means. I loved that house, with a specificity that went beyond sentiment. I loved the way the wooden floors creaked in a particular sequence. 2 short groans near the front door, 1 long moan at the top of the stairs. And I had memorized that sequence the way you memorize a password, something intimate and known only to you. I loved the smell of it in the mornings, a combination of coffee and old timber and the lavender sachets I kept in the linen closet. I loved the kitchen window that looked out over the narrow back garden, and the way the light came through it in the late afternoon, slow and amber, falling across the kitchen table in a way that made even a pile of unopened mail look like something worth painting. Daniel and I had been together for 8 years and married for 6. He was a project manager for a construction firm. Meticulous, calm, good with logistics, the kind of man who kept lists and color-coded his calendar and always knew where the car keys were. I worked from home as a freelance medical translator, handling Russian, English, and enough German to be professionally useful, and the arrangement suited us well. I had the flexibility, he had the structure, and together we ran the household like a small, competent operation that mostly hummed along without drama. We took 1 vacation a year, always somewhere with mountains because Daniel hated sand and I hated heat. We had a standing Saturday morning ritual. Farmer's market, then brunch at the Blue Canopy, a small place 3 blocks away where the owner knew our order and sometimes surprised us with something extra just because. We were not a passionate couple in the cinematic sense, but we were a steady one, and I had always believed that steadiness, in the long run, mattered more. His mother, Irene, had been a presence in our marriage that I managed rather than embraced. She was a compact woman in her early 60s, with silver hair cut very precisely and gray eyes that noticed everything. The kind of eyes that cataloged rooms the moment she walked into them. She had raised Daniel largely alone after a divorce when he was 12, and she wore that fact like a medal she was owed recognition for at all times. She had never been overtly hostile to me. That was the thing that made her so difficult to challenge. She operated through implication, through the gentle deployment of questions that weren't quite questions, through the faint sigh that said more than any sentence, "The kitchen curtains are rather dark, aren't they?" "Not that it's any of my business. You've been looking tired, Clara. Are you taking enough iron?" She had a particular talent for making me feel like a tenant in my own home whenever she visited, and I had made a kind of peace with this over the years. telling myself that she was a complicated woman with a real history of loss, that her sharpness was grief in a different coat, that the most gracious response was patience. My patience, as it turned out, was the single most useful thing she had to work with. The trouble arrived in the first week of November, wrapped in the ordinary packaging of a domestic emergency. Irene called Daniel on a Wednesday evening to say that the heating in her apartment had failed completely, and the landlord was refusing to respond to her calls, and that she needed somewhere to stay, just temporarily, just until the situation was resolved. Daniel came to me that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee mug turning in his hands, a habit he had when he was working up to something, and asked if it would be all right for his mother to take the spare bedroom for a week or two. He was careful about asking. He met my eyes, he used a tone that was genuinely uncertain, and something about the earnestness of his asking made me want to be generous. The house had a spare room. It was November. I said yes. She arrived on a Thursday with 2 large suitcases, a portable humidifier, and a framed photograph of Daniel at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning in a red sweater, which she placed on the guest room dresser without asking permission, with the confident ease of someone establishing territory. She thanked me warmly for having her. She kissed my cheek and said, "You're very generous, Clara. Daniel is lucky to have someone so understanding." I remember the small warmth I felt at those words. I remember thinking, with relief, that perhaps this arrangement would go more smoothly than I had feared. I hold that memory now the way you hold a coin you have discovered is counterfeit, aware of its weight, ashamed of having been fooled by it. The first week was awkward but navigable. Irene kept to herself in the mornings, appeared at meal times with the quietly expectant air of someone who assumes they will be fed, and spent her afternoons in the living room with the television at a volume that made it difficult for me to concentrate in the adjacent office. I adjusted my schedule. I wore headphones. I reminded myself it was temporary. The second week, the questions began. They were not dramatic questions, not sharp, not accusatory, nothing that could be called suspicious in isolation. They were conversational questions, the kind you ask when you are simply curious about your surroundings. When did you refinish these floors? They must have been expensive. Is your mortgage fixed or variable? Variable is such a risk. Was the roof redone recently? These older houses can be such a liability. I answered each one politely, and I watched Irene receive each answer with a small, attentive nod, filing it away behind those cataloging gray eyes. And I told myself that I was being uncharitable. She was 63 years old and displaced from her home. She was making conversation. She meant nothing by it. I told myself this with less and less conviction as the weeks passed. It was the third week when I came back from a walk and found Irene standing in my home office. She was not sitting at my desk. She was standing beside it, half-turned toward the window, with an expression of mild innocence so precisely assembled that I registered, before I could stop myself, how completely prepared it was. "I was looking for a pen," she said, turning to me with a small smile. "Of course," I said, and handed her one from the mug on my desk, and she thanked me and left, and I stood in the office doorway for a long moment after she was gone. My computer was open on the desk. I could not remember having left it open. I went to it and looked at the screen. My email was up, the inbox visible. I checked the sent folder. I checked the recently opened files. Nothing had been moved or sent, but my financial spreadsheets, detailed documents I kept in a folder called House, tracking the mortgage balance, maintenance costs, and my savings, were closed. I had not closed them. I distinctly remembered leaving them open before my walk. I stood at my desk and felt the skin on the back of my neck prickle, slowly and unmistakably, the way it does when something is wrong and your body knows it before your mind will admit it. I mentioned it to Daniel that evening. I waited until after dinner, until Irene had gone upstairs and the kitchen was quiet. And then I said carefully that I thought his mother might have been in my office while I was out. He was at the sink rinsing dishes, and he kept rinsing while I spoke. And when I finished, he said without turning around that she had probably just wandered in by mistake and that I shouldn't read too much into it. His voice was measured in a way that felt practiced. I watched the back of his shoulders, the deliberate evenness of them, the careful absence of tension, and felt the cold pebble of unease that had been sitting below my ribs since Irene's arrival settle a little lower, a little heavier. By mid-December, the apartment heating crisis showed no signs of resolution. Whenever I raised the subject of a timeline, Irene produced a fresh complication. The landlord was uncooperative, the building manager was incompetent, the lawyer was working on it, slowly, so slowly. Daniel nodded sympathetically each time she explained, and I sat across the table and watched his face and tried to find in it some trace of the impatience, the mild embarrassment, the subtle pressure to resolve the situation that I would have expected from a husband whose mother had been occupying his spare bedroom for 2 months. I found nothing of the kind. What I found instead was a careful, considered blankness, the face of someone who has already made a decision and is waiting for an appropriate moment to reveal it. I told my best friend Priya about it over coffee in early January. We were at the Blue Canopy, and I laid out everything. The questions about the house, the shuffled documents in the spare closet, the open computer, Daniel's increasing remoteness, the way he had started placing his phone screen down on the nightstand at night. Priya listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, stirring her coffee in slow circles. When I finished, she set down her spoon and said, "Clara, I think you need to look at your house documents." I stared at her. She said, "The deed, the mortgage papers, your name on everything. When did you last actually look?" I sat with that question for a moment. The honest answer was that I hadn't looked in over a year, maybe longer. The house was mine. It had always been mine. And I had never felt the need to verify what felt as certain as the ground beneath my feet. "This weekend," I said. "I'll go through everything this weekend." I didn't go through them that weekend. A work deadline intervened, and then the guest bathroom faucet developed a leak, which Irene reported to Daniel with the energized efficiency of someone who has been waiting for an occasion to be useful, and the documents stayed in their box in the spare closet for another 4 weeks. February came in gray and relentless, and the cold pebble in my chest had become something denser, something that shifted when I moved, a weight I was learning to carry. Daniel and I were still polite to each other, still going through the motions of a normal marriage with a competence that, in retrospect, should have frightened me. We still ate dinner together. We still went to the Blue Canopy on Saturdays, the 3 of us now. Irene installed at our corner table as though she had always been there. He still kissed me goodbye in the mornings. His lips were always, I now remember, slightly cool. And then came the morning of March 8th. I woke at 7, earlier than usual, to the gray light of a winter morning that had not yet decided whether it intended to improve. Daniel was already downstairs. I could hear him in the kitchen, the muffled domestic sounds of his morning routine, the coffee maker, the refrigerator door, the particular creak of the 3rd floorboard from the kitchen doorway. I lay in bed for a few minutes in that state between sleep and full wakefulness, and I thought, with a small, uncomplicated happiness that I can barely stand to remember now, that I would pick up tulips on my way back from my morning walk. Yellow ones. It was March 8th. We always marked it. I got up, showered, dressed in the dark because Daniel had left for the kitchen, and I didn't want to wake Irene down the hall. In the kitchen, Daniel was standing at the counter with his back to me. He was very still. Not the stillness of someone relaxed, but the stillness of someone concentrating, of someone who is trying not to make a sound. He was looking at his phone, and he heard me come in, and he turned, and his face did something I had never seen it do in 6 years of marriage. It closed, like a shutter, sudden and complete. He covered it immediately, smiled, said morning, asked if I wanted the last of the coffee. But the closing had happened, and I had seen it, and the knowledge of it sat in my chest like swallowed glass. We talked about nothing for a few minutes, the day, the weather, a grocery list. Then he said he had to be at the office early, and he kissed my cheek, cool lips as always now, and he was gone. I took my walk. I stopped at the florist, and my phone buzzed, Happy March 8th, X, don't come back. We changed the locks. The tulips hit the floor. The florist said something I couldn't hear. I was reading the message for the 4th time, and then the 5th, and the world had narrowed to the bright, small screen in my hands and the 11 words on it. My first thought was that it was a mistake. Autocorrect, a message meant for someone else, some terrible misdirection. My second thought arrived half a second later and dismantled the first entirely. You do not accidentally write we. The word we requires a second person, and there was only one other person in my house. I walked out of the shop without paying for the dropped tulips, walked 2 blocks through the cold before I realized I was walking, then stopped on the pavement outside a dry cleaner's and called Daniel's number. 4 rings. Voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. The third time, it didn't ring at all. It went directly to voicemail, which meant he had seen my name and declined. My husband had seen my name on his screen and pressed decline. I stood on that pavement for a long time, long enough for the cold to find the gaps in my coat, long enough for several strangers to walk around me with the mild irritation of people whose routes have been interrupted. I was thinking about the word we, and about Irene's gray eyes moving over my kitchen, and about the shuffled documents in the spare closet, and about Priya saying, "I think you need to look at your house documents," and everything was rearranging itself inside me into a picture I had been deliberately refusing to see for 3 months. I turned around and walked back to Elmwood Drive. My key still worked. I registered that with a small involuntary relief, the key turning, the door opening. And then I was inside, and the house smelled of coffee and of Irene's perfume, a heavy floral scent that I had always found slightly suffocating and now found nauseating. The house was quiet. Irene was upstairs. I went directly to the spare closet, took down the flat gray document box, carried it to the kitchen table, and opened it. The documents were all there, or appeared to be. I began going through them with the methodical attention I gave translations. Every page, every line. No rushing. The deed was the 4th document. It was a copy. Not the original. A photocopy printed on regular printer paper, which was wrong, because I knew the original was in this box, heavy and formal on its thick notarial stock. I set the copy aside and went through the rest of the box looking for the original. It was not there. I went through the box again. Still not there. I spread every document across the kitchen table in overlapping rows and went through each one individually, and the original deed was gone. In its place, tucked into the back of the folder behind a sheaf of old insurance statements, was a document I had never seen. It was a transfer of ownership form, printed on legal letterhead, with Daniel's signature at the bottom in blue ink. Below his signature was a second one, in slightly different ink, in a hand that took me a long, disoriented moment to recognize as my own. The date on the document was 2 weeks prior. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at my own name, signed to a document I had never in my life touched. And the kitchen was very quiet, and the refrigerator hummed, and the amber morning light moved across the table, and I thought, very calmly, for one impossible second, that's my handwriting. And then the full weight of what I was looking at arrived, not in stages, all at once like a wall of water. My signature had been forged. My house, the house I had bought with my grandfather's inheritance, the house I had owned before Daniel and I were even married, the house whose floors I knew by the sound of their creaking, was in the process of being transferred away from me. And my husband and his mother had done it together, quietly and carefully, over weeks, while I made them coffee and wore headphones in my office so as not to disturb anyone, and told myself again and again that I was imagining things. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the table and felt the cold wood against my palms and focused on that, the solidity of the table, the reality of the surface, because everything else had become terrifyingly liquid. I could hear my own breathing, loud and uneven in the morning quiet. I could hear the clock above the stove marking seconds with a patience that felt obscene. I could hear from upstairs the faint sounds of Irene beginning to move around, the soft tread of her feet, the creak of the guest room door opening. She would be down in 20 minutes. She would come into this kitchen, and she would find me at this table with her forgery in my hands, and I had perhaps 20 minutes to decide what to do before that happened. I picked up my phone. My hands were still shaking. I called Priya. She answered on the second ring, and I said very quietly, because I could hear Irene at the top of the stairs, "They forged my signature on a property transfer, both of them. The document is dated 2 weeks ago." Priya was silent for exactly 3 seconds. I counted them. And then she said, "Take photos of everything on that table. Every single document. Do it now, before you put anything back. Do not confront anyone until you've spoken to a lawyer. Do you understand me? Don't say a word to either of them." "Yes," I said, and I photographed every document on that table. All 23 of them, front and back, in the morning light from the kitchen window, while the clock ticked and the sound of Irene's footsteps moved steadily down the hall toward the top of the stairs. I had just finished replacing the last document in the box and returned it to the closet when I heard her on the stairs. I was back in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a mug of coffee I had poured but not drunk, when Irene appeared in the doorway in her dressing gown, silver hair still sleep-flattened on one side, looking exactly like what she had always presented herself as. A tired older woman, someone's mother, someone who needed taking care of. She looked at me. I looked at her. And I thought, with a coldness I had never felt before in my life, a coldness that was not emotion but its opposite, the place you reach when you are beyond emotion and into clarity. "I know what you did." I smiled at her. I said, "Good morning, Irene. Coffee?" And I poured her a cup with steady hands, and I watched her settle at my kitchen table, in my kitchen, in my house, and I thought, not for long. The morning passed in the finest performance of my life. I sat across from Irene at my kitchen table, drank coffee I couldn't taste, and responded to her conversation with the patience of someone who has not yet decided what to do with what she knows. She was in good spirits, unhurried, discussing a television program with the comfortable authority of someone who has nowhere to be. I watched her face the way I would watch a document I was translating, looking for the precise meaning beneath the surface. She looked entirely ordinary. She looked like someone's grandmother. She looked like someone who had never in her life sat at another woman's table, knowing she had forged that woman's signature and was in the process of stealing her house. I excused myself at 9:30, said I had a client call, went upstairs, and closed the door. Priya had sent me a name while I was still in the kitchen, Marcus Webb, property law. He answered on the third ring, and I told him, in the flat and precise manner I used for medical documents, exactly what I had found. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Don't touch anything else in that house. Don't confront them. Can you be in my office at 2 o'clock? I said yes. He said, "Bring the photographs. Bring every document you can access, mortgage correspondence, bank statements, anything related to the property. And Clara..." He used my name with a quiet firmness that felt, in that moment, like something solid to stand on. "Don't let them know you know. Not yet." I sat in my office for a moment after the call, looking at my grandfather's photograph on the corner of the desk, him squinting into Baltic sunlight, half smiling, and then I opened my laptop and pulled together everything Marcus had asked for. At 12:30, I heard the front door. Daniel had come home from his apparently urgent office. I heard him and Irene talking downstairs in the careful, lowered voices of people managing something together who believe they are alone. When Daniel called up to ask if I was home, I answered pleasantly. When he said there was soup, I said thank you. When I heard him settle back into the kitchen, reassured, I thought, good, let him think that. I left at 1:15 with a convincing errand as my excuse. In the doorway, Daniel's eyes moved over my face, searching for something I refused to give him. I watched him decide I didn't know, and watched the tension leave his shoulders, and thought, with a coldness I had not known I possessed, good. Marcus Webb's office was small and book-lined and smelled of old paper and printer ink. He was a compact man in his 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the manner of someone who has seen considerable amounts of human behavior and has long since stopped being surprised by any of it. He looked at my printed photographs for a long time. Then he said, "This is a transfer of ownership with a forged signature, dated February 22nd. If it had been filed, it would have gone through within 2 to 3 weeks. He looked at me over his glasses. "It has not been filed yet. I checked the county records before you arrived. Clara, you found this just in time. Just in time." I sat in that chair and let those words settle over me. 1 week later, and the house I had bought with my grandfather's inheritance, the house I had owned before Daniel and I were even married, would have been transferred out of my name by a document I had never signed, in a hand I had never used. Marcus laid out the next steps. An emergency injunction to prevent any transfer while the forgery was investigated. notification to the county recorder's office, a cease and desist, delivered to both Daniel and Irene simultaneously, and a police report, because forgery is a criminal matter, not merely a civil one. He told me to leave the house that night. Take your documents, your valuables, your passport. Come back tomorrow at 9. I drove back to Elmwood Drive in the early evening and sat in the car outside for a few minutes, looking at the lit kitchen window, at Daniel's silhouette moving past it as though it were any evening. Something settled in me then. Not peace, not forgiveness, but a cold and complete clarity. I knew what I was doing. I knew what I was going to lose and what I was going to keep, and I was, for the first time in months, entirely unafraid. I moved through the house with quiet efficiency. My passport, the mortgage documents Irene had not found, my laptop, my grandfather's photograph, my grandmother's ring. I touched the wooden floors, the kitchen door frame, the linen closet handle, each familiar surface, and I thought the same thought in every room. You will not have this. I left at 8, told Daniel I was going to Priya's for the evening. He looked at me one last time across the kitchen with that searching attention, and I gave him nothing to find. He said, "Drive safe." I looked at him, at the face I had loved and trusted for 8 years, at the man who had sat with me through grief and illness and had then, quietly and carefully, helped his mother plan to take my house while I made them both coffee. And I said, "Good night, Daniel." I walked out and did not look back at the lit window. The cease and desist arrived the following morning at 10, delivered by a process server. Both names. The injunction had already been filed with the county court. The police report had been submitted the previous afternoon. It was unfolding, Marcus said, exactly as it needed to. What I had not expected was Irene calling me herself 40 minutes after delivery. I was in Marcus's office when my phone rang. He nodded. Put it on speaker. Her voice was different. The softness was entirely gone, and what remained was something harder and more precise, a voice I had never heard her use, and which I understood at once was her real one. "Clara," she said, "I think we need to talk like adults." I said nothing. She said, "This is a misunderstanding. We were trying to protect the asset, the mortgage rate, the risk to the family." I said very quietly, "Irene, stop." I said, "I have photographs of the forged document. The county has been notified. A lawyer is sitting next to me. There is nothing you can say in this call that will help you. What I need you to do right now is get out of my house." A long silence. Then beneath it, something I had not prepared for. Not tears, not the performance of victimhood I had been bracing for, but the sound of a woman who has played a bad hand and knows it. She said, "Daniel told me you would never notice." She stopped as though the sentence had escaped before she could catch it. "Daniel told me you would never notice." Marcus's pen stopped moving on his notepad. The gray morning outside the window was very quiet. I said, "Tell him to call his lawyer," and I hung up. Marcus looked at me. I looked at Marcus. He said, "She just implicated him verbally on a recorded line." I said, "I know." I went back to the house that afternoon with Priya beside me because I needed to be there when Daniel came back, and I needed a witness. We sat in the kitchen with tea we didn't drink, and at 3:15 Daniel came through the front door. He had the face of someone who has been trying, on the drive home, to find a version of events he can survive and has not found one. He looked at Priya. He looked at me. He sat down at my kitchen table and put his face in his hands. I let him sit there. Then I said, "How long?" He didn't answer. I said it again. He said to his hands, "Since October. The heating was never broken. She needed to be in the house to access the documents. I arranged it." I said, "You arranged it. You arranged your mother moving into our home, her access to my documents. You knew about the forged signature." He said, "She forged it. I found it after she'd done it." I said, "And then you sent me a text on March 8th telling me not to come back." He lifted his face. His eyes were red. I looked at them and felt nothing. Not contempt, not grief, not the satisfaction of being right. Just a clean and certain absence. The feeling of a room after all the furniture has been removed. He said, "I panicked. I thought if you came back before we could file..." I said, "Look at me." He did. I said, "Get your things. You have until tomorrow morning." He started to speak. her name, some justification involving her age, her fear, her need for security. And Priya said from across the table, very quietly, "Don't. Just don't." Something in the flatness of it silenced him entirely. He got up and went upstairs, and I sat at my kitchen table with my palms flat against the wood, and I breathed. Irene was gone before he came back down. She had taken her 2 suitcases and her humidifier and left without a note. She left the framed photograph of 7-year-old Daniel on the guest room dresser. Whether that was an oversight or a final word, I never decided. The legal process took 4 months. The forgery charge led to a criminal investigation. Irene was formally charged in May. The civil proceedings were cleaner. The attempted transfer was nullified. The original deed was confirmed in my name alone. And Marcus filed a motion for costs that was partially granted. The divorce was uncontested. Daniel's lawyer sent mine a letter in June containing, buried in settlement language, 1 personal sentence. My client expresses his sincere regret. I read it once and set it down and did not read it again. I redecorated the guest room in July. I painted it a deep terracotta, a color I had always wanted somewhere in the house but had held back from, for reasons I now found irrelevant. I bought new kitchen curtains, brighter ones, because Irene had always said the dark ones made the kitchen feel closed. I hung them on a Tuesday morning while music played from my laptop and the coffee maker ran a second pot and the house was entirely incomparably mine. Priya was there. She handed me the curtain rings one by one and said, watching me work, that I looked different. I asked how. She thought about it. She said, like someone who has been carrying something very heavy and has finally put it down. Not relieved, just lighter. Like you remember how to stand. That was it exactly. I was not unmarked. I will not pretend I came through it unchanged, or that the year did not cost me things I had believed were permanent. But I was lighter, and I was standing, and the floors of my house still creaked in the pattern I knew by heart, and the lavender sachets still scented the linen closet, and the late afternoon light still came through the kitchen window in its long amber way, falling across the table and making everything it touched look briefly like something worth keeping. The tulips are on my kitchen windowsill now in a glass vase I bought at the market last spring. They are yellow because yellow is the color of good news, and I have decided that the meaning of yellow tulips is mine to assign. They mean this, that things which are lost can be recovered, that ground which has been taken from you can be reclaimed, and that the woman who dropped them on a florist's shop floor on a March morning and walked out into the cold and then turned herself around and walked back, that woman was worth standing up for. I am glad every single morning that I did.